Okay, let's unpack this. We've all been hearing so much about the latest AI models, right? Especially the ones that, seem to actually think through problems step by step.
Yeah, the ones showing their work.
Exactly. People are calling them large reasoning models, LRMs. They seem built for, well, complex tasks, and there's a ton of excitement.
There really is. And you see these results on standard tests, things like math, coding, very impressive stuff.
Hmm.
But it does leave this big question hanging. How well are they actually reasoning? Is it real thinking or, something that just looks like it?
And that question is exactly what we're digging into today. We found this really fascinating research paper. They decided to test this whole reasoning thing differently.
Not just the usual benchmarks.
No, they built these controlled puzzle environments instead.
Yeah.
The whole idea was to really poke at how these LRMs reason, not just whether they get the final answer right.
Right, getting under the hood a bit.
Yeah. So our mission here is to get past just the surface scores. We want to understand the real strengths and, well, some pretty surprising weaknesses these models show when you put them up against logic puzzles where you can tweak the difficulty very precisely.
And help you get a clearer picture of what they can and maybe can't actually do when things get tricky.
And just to be clear, everything we're talking about comes straight from this one specific research paper. They went with puzzles for a reason.
Yeah, it gave them that tight control over complexity. Let them look not just at the final answer, but inside the model's head, so to speak, at the thinking traces.
Which is apparently much harder to do cleanly with the standard tests.
Well, yeah, partly because of things like data contamination. The model might have already seen similar problems during its training. Puzzles avoid that a bit better, or at least give you more control.
Okay, that makes sense. That control sounds key.
It really is.
Yeah.
It lets you isolate how the reasoning process itself holds up as the problem gets harder.
So before we jump into the big findings, maybe let's just quickly set the stage. What exactly are these LRMs and why is testing them tricky?
Sure. So large reasoning models, or LRMs, are basically souped-up versions of standard large language models, LLMs. They have extra bits bolted on, things designed to encourage explicit reasoning.
Like the step-by-step stuff.
Exactly. The most common one is generating that step-by-step process, often called chain of thought. Some also try to do self-reflection, things like that. We're talking models like OpenAI's o1, o3, DeepSeek R1, Claude 3.7, Sonnet Thinking, Gemini Thinking, those kinds of names.
Gotcha. The ones that give you the long explanation before the answer.
Right. Now, testing them,
Yeah.
it's tough. The standard benchmarks, math, code, they're useful, sure, but they've got limitations.
Like the data contamination you mentioned.
Yeah, that's one. They might have essentially memorized how to solve certain types of problems or seen very similar examples. Makes it hard to know if they're reasoning or recalling. And the other thing is, most benchmarks just check the final answer, right or wrong. They don't tell you much about the quality of the thinking or how efficiently the model got there. Was it a smart path or just lucky?
Which brings us back to why this paper used puzzles. Much clearer signal.
Precisely. With puzzles, you can change parameters. Add a disk to the Tower of Hanoi, add blocks in Blocks World. You ramp up the difficulty step by step.
But the core logic stays the same.
The core logic type, yeah. And crucially, you can look at those intermediate thinking traces and actually check them, often using simulators to see if the steps are valid.
Okay, so what puzzles did they actually use? What were they testing?
They use four main types, chosen to represent different kinds of logical structures, different ways, complexity scales.
Right.
First, Tower of Hanoi. Moving disks between pegs. Can't put bigger on smaller? Classic. The key here is complexity scales exponentially. Adding just one dig makes it way, way harder.
Okay, exponential. That gets tough fast.
Then, checker jumping. Swapping rows of checkers, red and blue, on a line. You slide or jump. Here, complexity scales quadratically. So, harder as you add checkers, but not as explosively as Hanoi.
Quadratic. Got it. Still harder, but more gradual.
Third was river crossing. Getting people or things across a river in a boat, but with rules. Like, don't leave the fox with the chickens unsupervised, that kind of thing. Complexity depends on how many pairs or items you need to move with constraints.
Right, those logic puzzles.
And finally, Blocks World. Rearranging stacks of blocks to match a target picture. But you can only move the top block of any stack. Complexity goes up with the number of blocks.
So a nice mix, different types of logic, different ways to make them harder. Seems like a solid way to test things.
Yeah, it gives you a much cleaner look at the reasoning itself, separate from, say, vast world knowledge.
Okay, let's get to it then. What did they actually find? What did this careful testing show about how LRMs handle these challenges?
Okay, so the first really big finding was this pattern they saw. Three distinct performance regimes, depending on how complex the puzzle was.
Three regimes.
Yeah. And they compared the LRMs, the thinking models, against standard LLMs from the same family, but without the explicit thinking steps. Importantly, they gave both types the same computational budget, the same number of inference tokens to use.
So a fair fight in terms of resources. What happened?
Okay, regime one, low complexity, simple versions of the puzzles. And here, counterintuitively, the standard models, the non-thinkers, were often better.
Better. How?
More accurate sometimes, and definitely more efficient. They used way fewer tokens. It looked like the LRMs were, well, overthinking it,
Yeah.
generating lots of steps they didn't really need for easy problems.
Huh. Overthinking easy stuff. Didn't expect that.
Yeah, me neither initially,
I don't-
but it came regime two, medium complexity. This is where things
Well,
flip.
the LRM started to shine.
Exactly. In this middle range, the models with the explicit thinking process clearly outperformed the standard ones. Generating those steps, that chain of thought, really seemed to help when the problem got moderately tricky.
Okay, so thinking helps, but maybe only when it's actually needed.
Seems like it. But then there's regime three, high complexity, really hard versions of the puzzles.
And what happened there? Did the thinking models power through?
No. This is where it got pretty stark. For both types of models, thinkers and non-thinkers, performance basically collapsed. Accuracy dropped to near zero.
Whoa, a total breakdown, even for the LRMs.
Pretty much. The thinking mechanism might have pushed the failure point slightly further out, letting them handle maybe one more disk in Hanoi or something. But it didn't prevent the collapse. They still hit a wall, hard.
Wow. Okay, so for you listening, what's the main takeaway here?
The big takeaway from this first finding is that thinking out loud ability is useful, but only in a certain band of difficulty. It doesn't make models better at simple stuff, might even make them worse, or at least slower. And crucially, it doesn't save them from failing completely when faced with really high complexity. It's not a magic bullet for hard problems.
That's a really important nuance. Okay, let's dig into that collapse point more. That leads us to the second key finding, right? What did they notice about the model's internal effort as they got close to failing?
Right, this is where it gets even more intriguing, maybe a bit weird. So as the puzzles got harder, moving from medium towards high complexity, the LRMs initially did what you'd expect.
Worked harder, used more steps.
Yeah, they increased their thinking effort, used more tokens, generated longer reasoning traces. Makes sense, harder problem needs more thought, right?
Seems logical.
But then came the twist. Right as they approached that complexity level where their accuracy just plummeted, they started to reduce their thinking effort.
Wait, they used fewer thinking tokens right before they failed, even though they had the budget.
Exactly. They had plenty of token budget left, but they generated shorter thought traces on the problems they were about to completely fail on.
That seems backwards. Why
Yeah.
would they do that?
Well, that's the puzzle. It strongly suggests the limitation isn't just about needing more compute time or more steps. It points towards maybe a more fundamental issue with the reasoning process itself scaling up. Like the internal mechanism starts to break down or become less effective beyond a certain complexity threshold, regardless of the available budget. They sort of give up generating useful steps.
So it's not just running out of steam, it's like the engine itself seizing up.
That's a good way to put it. It challenges the simple idea that just giving them more resources will solve deep reasoning problems.
Yeah.
There seems to be an inherent scaling limit in the way they reason currently.
Fascinating, and a bit concerning for scaling hopes. Okay, let's move to the third key finding. Since they could look inside the thinking traces with these puzzles, what did they actually see happening in those generated thoughts?
Yeah, this was a neat part of the study. They can use simulators for the puzzles to check the validity of each step the model proposed within its thought process. Like, is this a legal move in Tower of Hanoi? Did it violate a river crossing rule?
So they could track the internal logic step by step.
Right. And what they saw inside those traces mirrored the overall performance patterns we just talked about.
How so?
Okay, at low complexity, remember how the LRMs were inefficient? Inside the traces, they often found the correct solution paths pretty early on. The simulator confirmed it was valid.
Okay.
But then they just keep going, generating lots of incorrect moves or exploring dead-end paths after finding the right answer. It was like internal overthinking. They had the solution but kept getting distracted by wrong ideas.
Found the needle, then buried it in more hay.
Kind of, yeah. Then, at medium complexity, where LRMs did better overall, the pattern changed. The correct solution path tended to show up later in the thinking trace.
After trying other things.
Exactly. It looked like the model was exploring various incorrect options first, maybe realizing they were wrong, and then hitting on the correct sequence. This suggests some kind of internal trial and error or self-correction was actually happening and being productive at this level.
So the thinking process was actually helping them find the answer.
It seemed to be, yes. But then, at high complexity, consistent with the total performance collapse.
Let me guess. No correct paths found at all.
You got it. Within the entire thinking trace, the models simply failed to generate any sequence of moves that constituted a valid solution. All the internal exploration led to dead ends or rule violations.
So looking inside confirms the picture. The thinking is inefficient on easy tasks, helpful, but perhaps involves some fumbling on medium ones, and just completely breaks down on hard ones. Self-correction fails.
Exactly. It shows us a bit more about why they fail. The internal generation process itself isn't robust enough when the combinatorial complexity gets too high.
Okay, beyond these main performance patterns, the paper also highlighted some results they called puzzling behaviors. Things that really make you go, what were some of those?
Yeah, there were a couple of really striking ones that challenged basic assumptions. One huge one was back to the Tower of Hanoi puzzle.
Okay.
So, for some runs, the researchers didn't just give the model the puzzle rules. They gave it the actual explicit, step-by-step, recursive algorithm for solving Tower of Hanoi.
They gave it the cheat sheet, like literally the instructions, move disk from A to C, then D to A, that kind of thing.
Pretty much, yeah. The exact logical steps required. You'd think, okay, now it doesn't have to figure out the strategy, it just has to follow the instructions. Performance should skyrocket, especially on harder versions.
Absolutely. It's just execution at that point.
But that's not what happened. Providing the explicit algorithm, it barely made a difference. Performance did not significantly improve, and that accuracy collapsed. It still happened at roughly the same complexity level.
You're kidding! They couldn't even follow the instructions reliably when it got complex.
Apparently not. It suggests a potential limitation, not just in strategy discovery, but in the basic ability to reliably execute a sequence of known, given logical steps.
Wow. That's fundamental. If you can't trust it to follow a clear algorithm.
It definitely raises questions about their capacity for what you might call exact computation or procedural execution. Things we often take for granted in reasoning.
Okay, that's one major puzzle. Were there others? You mentioned inconsistencies.
Yes. They saw really weird differences in how models failed depending on the type of puzzle. Take Claude 3.7 Sonnet Thinking, for example.
Okay.
On a tricky Tower of Hanoi problem, it might successfully generate, say, over 100 correct moves in sequence before finally making a mistake.
Yeah.
A long chain of correct logic.
Impressive stamina.
Yeah, but then you look at the river crossing puzzle. On instances that actually required fewer total moves to solve at that same general complexity level, the same model might fail after making only, like, 4 correct moves.
Hold on. It can do 100+ steps right in one puzzle, but falls apart after 4 steps in another, even if the second one is technically shorter overall.
That's what they found sometimes. It shows that difficulty for these models isn't just about the sheer number of steps, the compositional depth.
It's about the kind of steps.
It seems highly dependent on the specific type of logic or the structure of the puzzle. Maybe they've seen patterns related to Hanoi more in training. Or maybe the constraints in river crossing just trip them up in a way that Hanoi's rules don't, even if fewer steps are needed. The paper showed graphs where, yeah, a model could solve a 127-step Hanoi problem, but fail a 12-step river crossing one.
That really suggests it's not a general abstract reasoning engine. It's sensitive to the specifics in unexpected ways.
Exactly. It points away from a uniform reasoning capability and towards something more patchy, maybe influenced heavily by training data specifics or inherent architectural biases.
Okay, let's try to tie all this together then. We've got the 3 performance regimes: bad on easy, good on medium, collapse on hard. We've got the weird reduction in thinking effort right before collapse. We saw the inefficient thoughts and the breakdown of self-correction. And now these startling issues with following algorithms and inconsistent performance across puzzle types. What's the big picture here for AI reasoning?
Well, pulling it all together, it paints a picture where, yes, current LRMs are impressive. They do show reasoning-like abilities emerging, especially in that medium complexity zone. But these results strongly challenge the idea that they've achieved truly general, scalable reasoning like humans have.
The kind that works reliably everywhere.
Right. They seem to operate well in a specific sweet spot, but they hit these fundamental walls when problems get genuinely complex or require strict adherence to logic or just present a different kind of structure than they're used to.
And why is really internalizing this important for, for you listening?
Because it's crucial for setting realistic expectations. We see these models generate text that looks incredibly intelligent, breaking down problems step by step.
The illusion of thinking the paper mentions.
Exactly. That surface plausibility can be very convincing. But this deep dive using these controlled puzzles shows that the underlying process is brittle. It hits hard limits when you push the complexity or change the logical demands. Understanding this gap between the appearance of reasoning and the underlying fragility is key to using these tools wisely and knowing where not to trust them yet.
It's a great point. Generating convincing text about reasoning isn't the same as actually having a robust reasoning ability that you can count on under pressure.
Precisely.
Okay, well, this has been incredibly illuminating. A real deep dive into how these advanced models actually grapple with logic.
Yeah, we looked at this research using puzzles, Tower of Hanoi, checker jumping, river crossing, blocks world to really put large reasoning models to the test.
And the story that emerged wasn't simple. Good in the middle, but struggling at the extremes. We saw that surprising drop in effort before failure.
The overthinking on simple tasks and that shocking inability to reliably follow even explicit algorithms when things got tough.
Plus, that inconsistent performance, acing along sequences in one puzzle type while failing quickly on seemingly simpler ones of a different type.
Yeah, not just about the number of steps, but the kind of logic involved.
Which really leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. If these state-of-the-art models, the ones designed for reasoning, struggle to consistently follow explicit instructions, and if their ability breaks down so differently depending on the type of puzzle logic, what does that really say about the nature of their reasoning? Is it the adaptable general intelligence we're aiming for? Or is it still fundamentally a very sophisticated form of pattern matching that's brittle outside its training experience? It makes you wonder what the real path forward is to achieve AI reasoning that's truly robust in general.